You ever had your entire career erased in a single sentence? I have. And it didn't happen behind closed doors or in some HR email. No, mine happened in front of the entire executive team, the same people who once called me the backbone of the company. That Monday morning I walked into the boardroom carrying notes, system reports, ready to present what I'd spent the whole weekend preparing. But instead of a meeting, I walked straight into an ambush. At the head of the table sat Richard Hayes, the brand new CEO, dressed like he was about to host a late-night talk show. His tie sharp, his smile sharper. He didn't even let me sit down. "Ethan," he said, calm as ice, "your position no longer exists." Effective immediately. Silence hit harder than shouting. No gasps, no protests. Just eyes dropping to the table, pens tapping nervously. Even Chloe, my former mentee, the one I trained late nights years ago, couldn't bring herself to look at me. Richard slid a sealed envelope across the glass like it was the check at a dinner party. I didn't touch it. I didn't argue. I just placed my badge in the middle of the table, looked him dead in the eye, and said 2 words, "Understood." Then I walked out, not in defeat, but in certainty. Because what Richard and the others didn't know was this: when they thought they were firing me, they had just triggered a countdown I had set months before. And the clock had already started. When I walked out of that boardroom, leaving my badge behind and hearing the door click shut behind me, I wasn't just leaving a job. I was walking away from 18 years of my life. But here's the thing, that so-called life they thought they owned was never really theirs. Because long before Carrion Technologies became the rising star on glossy magazines and investor slideshows, it was a crumbling mess on the verge of bankruptcy, a company nobody believed in, a sinking ship waiting for the final wave. And that's where I came in. I wasn't some fresh graduate with buzzwords or a fancy pitch deck. I was the one they called when everything was already on fire. Wires crossed, data leaking everywhere, vendors pulling out left and right. It wasn't just broken, it was chaos. And they handed me the impossible: fix it or watch it die. Now, I don't know about you, but when you're faced with a system so fragile it can't survive another quarter, you don't patch holes, you build a spine. That's what I did. Quietly, carefully, with more sleepless nights than I can count, I designed something that didn't just patch their cracks but held the whole damn building together. I called it Sentinel. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't meant to sell, it was meant to survive. Think of it like the nervous system of the body: nobody sees it, nobody praises it, but without it, nothing else works. And here's something interesting: I never trusted Carrion enough to let Sentinel live fully inside their servers. Too much politics, too many short-sighted executives. I saw it early: leadership changing hands, board members fighting over scraps, the hunger for control over actual progress. So instead of tying Sentinel's life to their fragile core, I built it on my own infrastructure, outside, safe, registered under my own LLC, buried beneath lines of routine hosting metadata. They used it every single day without realizing it was never theirs. Legally, technically, practically, I held the keys. You know, people often ask me, why didn't I just tell them? Why didn't I demand credit, push my name into the spotlight? The truth is, credit doesn't keep systems alive. Reliability does. And Sentinel never failed. Not once. That was my quiet power. And let me pause here to ask you, have you ever built something for someone else, something that became the core of their success, only to watch them pretend it was theirs? If you've been there, drop your story in the comments, because I want to hear it. Did you stay silent like I did? Or did you fight back? Let's see how many of us have been the ghost behind someone else's empire. Back to my story: Sentinel was invisible, by design. Even when I got promoted to lead systems architect, I kept it out of official documentation. Colleagues saw alerts they couldn't explain, little ghost pings that only I knew how to trace. Even Savannah, back then just a rookie shadowing me, never asked where those alerts came from. To her, I was just the mentor who knew how to fix things. To me, I was building a firewall of trust with no name on it, because I already knew one day that trust would run out. So when Richard Hayes walked into that boardroom months ago, smiling like he'd won, cutting me off in front of everyone, he thought he was ending a chapter. What he didn't know was that the page had already been written. I had coded a contingency into Sentinel, a quiet command, a safety net for myself. If my credentials were ever terminated under hostile conditions, Sentinel would start a silent lockdown. Not explosive, not obvious. Just a gradual freeze, one layer at a time, until the company that erased me began to feel the cracks of its own arrogance. Think about that for a second. Imagine someone ripping your name off the org chart, erasing 18 years with a flick of their wrist, and you don't panic. You don't beg. You don't even raise your voice. You just walk out knowing that the foundation beneath them is still yours, and at any moment, you can remind them of it. That's the power of preparation, of foresight, of refusing to be disposable even when they treat you like you are. And that's exactly why I didn't feel anger that morning. My pulse was steady, too steady, because it wasn't a surprise. It was protocol. I had already written the ending, and I was about to watch it unfold, piece by piece. And that's why I didn't panic when I walked out of that boardroom. Because I knew Sentinel was quietly breathing in the background, waiting. But what I didn't know yet was how quickly the knives inside the company would turn, not from strangers, but from people I once trusted. And let me tell you, betrayal never comes from the enemy across the street, it comes from the person sitting right beside you. After Richard Hayes took the CEO chair, everything at Carrion shifted. Overnight, it wasn't about systems, stability, or the people who kept the lights on. It was about optics. Suddenly, the office was filled with new faces, young, stylish, curated like a startup ad campaign. Neutral tone outfits, buzzwords rolling off their tongues like they'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. Cross-functional innovation. Next-gen workflows. The kind of words that sound impressive until you realize they mean nothing. And there I was, 18 years in the trenches, reduced to a ghost in the hallway. No team, no office, just a shared desk shoved in the corner of a floor nobody cared about. My email signature changed from lead systems architect to temporary technical advisor. A quiet erasure, like they were trying to pretend I'd never existed. But the part that stung wasn't Richard or his hand-picked squad. It was Savannah. The same Savannah I trained years ago, back when she couldn't tell the difference between a test environment and a production server. I remember late nights teaching her, showing her shortcuts, giving her confidence when she doubted herself. And now? She wouldn't even make eye contact when we crossed paths. That thin smile she wore, it wasn't kindness. It was performance. Let me ask you something. Have you ever poured your time, your knowledge, into someone, only to have them turn their back the moment you became inconvenient? If that's ever happened to you, drop a comment, because I think more of us have lived through that kind of quiet betrayal than we admit. The new team strutted around with their perfect haircuts and smart watches, talking like they were reinventing the wheel. And then came Trey Dawson, one of Richard's golden hires. One morning, I found him in the server room, holding a tablet, looking lost. He flashed me that overconfident grin, the kind only the untested can wear. Hey, Ethan, quick one. This directory here, safe to delete? Looks like it hasn't been touched in months. I froze. He was pointing at Sentinel's decoy structure, a carefully planted dummy I'd designed to mislead anyone poking too deep. Deleting it wouldn't destroy the company, but it would trigger Sentinel's self-preservation mode. He had no idea what he was about to set off. You shouldn't touch that, I said calmly. It's tied to some legacy workflows. He waved me off, smug as ever. No worries, already queued it for deletion. Gotta clean out the cobwebs, right? I didn't argue. I didn't stop him. Because here's the truth, when someone thinks they're smarter than the system, sometimes the best thing you can do is let them find out for themselves. And Sentinel was ready. Meanwhile, Savannah climbed higher. Promotions, presentations, standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard like she'd built the foundation herself. But she never looked my way. Not once. And that silence was louder than any insult. It was in those weeks that I realized Carrion wasn't just replacing me with younger faces. They were rewriting history. They weren't interested in talent, in backbone, in the systems that kept the company alive. They wanted style, buzzwords, and photo ops. They wanted the illusion of innovation, not the messy truth of infrastructure. And I knew exactly where that illusion would lead them. By the way, if you're enjoying this story and you want more true tales of quiet revenge and hard-earned redemption, make sure to hit subscribe. That way you won't miss the next chapter, because trust me, it only gets messier from here. Back in the office, I watched as Trey's deletion request rolled through the system. On his dashboard, it showed as completed successfully. He probably walked out of that server room feeling proud of himself. But what he didn't know was that Sentinel had already duplicated the structure, hidden the original, and rewritten the logs to trick him. His command had succeeded, in his eyes. In reality, Sentinel had just saved Carrion from a catastrophic failure, again. Nobody thanked me. Nobody even knew. And that was the point. Sentinel wasn't built to be noticed. It was built to protect. Even from its own users. And yet, sitting in that corner desk with no nameplate, watching Savannah present my ideas with Richard nodding along, I started to feel something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. A realization that the people I had given everything to didn't just forget me. They were actively burying me. Erasing me. Replacing me with style over substance. And all I had left was the system they didn't even realize wasn't theirs. But that, I thought, might just be enough. They thought burying me in a nameless corner desk would make me disappear. They thought promoting Savannah, parading Trey around, dressing up buzzwords as breakthroughs would erase 18 years of blood, sweat, and code. But the truth they never understood was this: the backbone of Carrion wasn't in their presentations, or their slogans, or their fresh young hires. The backbone was mine. And I had built it to answer to me, and only me. Long before Richard Hayes showed up with his sharp tie and sharper smile, before Savannah learned enough to forget where she came from, I had already prepared for this day. I knew the signs. You don't spend almost 2 decades in a company without learning to read the language of leadership changes, the sudden budget freezes, the whispers about streamlining, the obsession with control. I saw it coming. And while they were planning to cut me out, I was writing a different script entirely. The script was Sentinel. Sentinel wasn't just a system. It was my silent guardian, my unseen insurance policy. Every transaction, every data packet, every workflow inside Carrion passed through it, invisible but essential, like veins carrying blood through a body no one ever thinks about until they're cut. And here's the part they never saw coming: Sentinel didn't live on Carrion's servers. No, it lived on my own. Registered under my LLC, buried behind layers of metadata so ordinary it looked like nothing more than background noise. To them, it was just the system. To me, it was mine. Legally, technically, practically mine. Think about that for a second. They fired me, erased me, treated me like an outdated piece of furniture. But every email they sent, every dashboard they opened, every sales order they logged, it all passed through my hands first. They just didn't know it. And I'll be honest with you, there's something both terrifying and empowering about holding that kind of quiet power. Terrifying, because if I let anger drive me, I could have burned the whole empire to the ground in seconds. Empowering, because I didn't need to. I just needed them to know that I couldn't be erased. That no matter how hard they tried, I was still in the walls, still in the wires, still in the foundation they pretended to own. Have you ever been in a place where the only thing keeping you steady was the knowledge that deep down, you still had leverage? That they could strip away the title, the office, the recognition, but they could never take away what you built? If you know that feeling, I want you to leave a comment, because I think a lot of us have lived quieter versions of this story. That's why, months before Richard's ambush in the boardroom, I coded something special into Sentinel. A contingency. A trigger. If my credentials were ever revoked under hostile conditions, Sentinel would respond, not with an explosion, not with a crash, but with a silent suffocation. One system at a time, one delay at a time, until Carrion began to feel the cracks. Payroll hiccups. Emails stalling. Client data desyncing. Small things, untraceable things, the kind of errors executives blame on aging infrastructure. They'd scramble, they'd panic, but they'd never find the source. Because the source was me. And here's what made it beautiful, I didn't even need to lift a finger. The moment Richard Hayes smiled across that boardroom table and told me I no longer existed, he had already pulled the trigger himself. I didn't have to do anything but walk away. The countdown had begun. But understand this, it wasn't about revenge. Not really. If I'd wanted revenge, I could have destroyed them in a single night. No, this was about something deeper. About being seen. About refusing to let them rewrite history with me cut out of the frame. Sentinel wasn't built to hurt them. It was built to remind them who built them. So while Savannah stood on stage at company demos, reciting words she barely understood, while Trey poked around in directories he couldn't even name properly, while Richard sold illusions to investors, I sat quietly in my corner, watching. Waiting. Knowing the moment would come when the system they thought they controlled would show them the truth. And when that moment arrived, I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to raise my voice. All I had to do was let Sentinel speak for me. Sentinel didn't roar, it whispered. And that was the beauty of it. While Richard Hayes strutted around the office with his sleeves rolled up like some hero CEO, while Savannah Miller smiled on stage as if she had reinvented the backbone of Carrion, while Trey Dawson tapped his smartwatch pretending he understood half the code he touched, the system they all depended on was already shifting beneath their feet. Slowly. Quietly. By design. The first ripple came 2 days after my so-called transition. Payroll hiccups. HR tried logging hours into the system, only to watch screens freeze halfway through submission. They hit refresh, tried again, and again. Same loop, same failure. They called IT. IT shrugged, blamed server latency. Nothing got fixed. Then came the emails. Messages delayed, threads breaking apart mid-chain, calendar invites sent but never received. Teams who lived and breathed through Slack started switching back to desk phones like it was 2005. Imagine that, an entire tech company reduced to missed calls and sticky notes. And me? I sat in my apartment, lights dim, Sentinel's admin console glowing across my desk. Each disruption appeared on the log like a soft heartbeat. 8:42 a.m., payroll API delay. 9:01 a.m., financial desync. 9:15 a.m., login loop timeout. Nothing catastrophic, nothing traceable, just a steady pulse of frustration spreading through the veins of Carrion Technologies. You see, I wasn't trying to crash the company overnight. That would have been too obvious, too messy. No, I wanted them to feel it. To wake up every morning knowing something was off but not being able to name it. That's the kind of pressure that breaks empires from the inside. And if you've ever had someone underestimate you, write you off like you didn't matter, you know the feeling. You don't need to scream. You just need them to realize, slowly, painfully, that they were wrong about you. If you've lived through that, I want you to drop a comment, because I know I'm not alone in this. By late morning, whispers were spreading through the halls. Analysts refreshing dashboards only to see numbers stall. Sales reps calling clients manually to confirm shipments because the CRM refused to sync. And through it all, Richard Hayes kept his confident grin, assuring everyone it was nothing but growing pains. But behind closed doors, panic was building. I knew because Sentinel showed me everything. Savannah's login attempts spiking, Trey hammering diagnostic commands he didn't even understand, Richard authorizing temporary access for outside contractors. Sentinel logged it all, cold and precise. I could almost picture the scene in the boardroom, Richard pacing, Savannah flipping through slides that no longer matched reality, Trey sweating as he pretended to troubleshoot. And none of them realizing that every system they touched still ran through the nervous system I had built. What they didn't know was that Sentinel wasn't fighting them. Not yet. It was simply watching, recording, learning their patterns like a chess player studying opponents who think they're winning the game. And that's where the satisfaction came in. Because when you've been humiliated in front of a room full of people, when you've been erased from history, the sweetest revenge isn't shouting back. It's silence. Controlled. Calculated. Absolute. Let me pause here to say, if this story hits home, if you've ever wanted to turn the tables in silence instead of noise, make sure you subscribe. There's more to come, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next moves. Back at Carrion, the silence was turning to noise. Department heads demanding answers, clients raising red flags, investors asking why numbers weren't syncing on their dashboards. Richard doubled down, calling for all-hands meetings, promising transparency while delivering excuses. Savannah echoed him, her voice polished but hollow, words that carried no weight against the frustration boiling in the room. And in the middle of it all, Sentinel advanced to Phase 2. A subtle escalation. User permissions misaligned just slightly so credentials didn't work the first time. Scheduling processes delayed by milliseconds that grew into minutes. Nothing that would spark alarms, but enough to make every team question their own competence. That was the genius of it. They couldn't blame me, because as far as they knew, I was gone. They couldn't blame the system, because Sentinel had never failed them before. They could only blame themselves, their new vision, their so-called innovation. And every hour that passed, the weight pressed down harder. I leaned back in my chair, sipping cold coffee, watching the logs stack up on my screen. Not smiling, not celebrating. Just steady. Focused. Because this wasn't revenge for the sake of revenge. This was balance. A reminder that you can fire a title, but you can't erase the architect. And as I sat there, watching Carrion's empire stumble piece by piece, I knew the real collapse hadn't even started yet. This was just the silence before the storm. The silence before the storm never lasts forever. And by the third day of Sentinel's quiet pressure, the cracks at Carrion weren't just hidden whispers anymore, they were starting to show in broad daylight. Departments stalled, clients complained, and frustration echoed through every floor like a fire alarm no one could locate. I sat in my apartment, blinds half closed, Sentinel's console lighting my desk in a cold blue glow. The logs scrolled steadily, each line a pulse, failed login, corrupted sync, unauthorized attempt denied. But then, something new appeared, an entry that froze me mid-sip of coffee. Deep trace scan detected. Origin, Felix Tran. Felix. I remembered him, a junior systems engineer, quiet, meticulous, one of the few who didn't strut around pretending to be a genius. Unlike Trey, he actually read code instead of faking it. And now, Sentinel was telling me he had stumbled on something buried deep in the CRM pipeline, a relay command tagged with the word that was never supposed to surface, sentineloxy.root.log. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My system, my lifeline, had whispered its name to someone inside Carrion. Felix didn't have the clearance to open it, of course. Sentinel kicked him out, scrubbed the path, buried it deeper. But he had seen enough to know there was something there. And here's where it got dangerous, because secrets don't stay secrets once someone gets curious. Especially not in a company already on edge, desperate for answers. I knew exactly what would happen next. Felix would take it to Savannah. Savannah would take it to Richard. And suddenly, the ghost in their wires wouldn't feel like a glitch anymore. It would feel like a threat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, the city outside humming its indifferent song. 18 years of loyalty reduced to silence, betrayal from the one I trained, and now the system I built risking exposure from someone too thorough for his own good. I had always known this moment might come. I just didn't expect it so soon. And let me ask you, have you ever guarded something so carefully, something that was yours and yours alone, only to feel it slipping through your fingers because of someone else's mistake? What did you do? Did you protect it, or did you let it burn? Drop your story in the comments, because I want to know how many of you have stood on that same edge. Back inside Carrion, I imagined the boardroom again. Richard leaning forward, eyes sharp, his patience fraying. Savannah tense, her polished words starting to crack. Trey pretending to understand Felix's discovery, probably making it sound worse than it was just to prove his worth. And Felix, caught in the middle, trying to explain that he had found something he couldn't name. Sentinel showed me the aftermath. Unauthorized login spikes. Failed credential escalations. Savannah's ID appearing over and over, hammering at doors she didn't have the keys for. And then one entry that clenched my jaw, root restructure request, origin Savannah, Miller at Carrion Tech. She wasn't just trying to understand it. She was trying to rewrite it. To take my system, my spine, and put her name on it. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding but face calm. Years ago, I had covered for her mistakes. Years ago, I had carried her when she almost lost a client's trust by leaking financial data. And now? She was erasing me all over again. But here's the difference, this time, I wasn't powerless. I typed a command into Sentinel's console, activate watch mode trace. Unauthorized access logs rerouted to shadow channel. Monitoring initiated. A single confirmation blinked back at me, steady and quiet. From that moment, every keystroke Savannah made, every command Richard authorized, every scan Trey or Felix attempted, it all flowed straight to me. I wasn't just watching them scramble, I was inside their scramble. Meanwhile, Carrion's public face was crumbling. Investors started asking sharp questions. Clients grew restless. And then came the boardroom bombshell, someone finally asked Richard outright, who owns Sentinel? I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. Sentinel was watching for me. And when that question hit the table, I knew everything was about to change. When the question finally landed, it cut sharper than any system failure ever could. Who owns Sentinel? That single line, dropped into the middle of the investor call, shattered the script Richard Hayes had been clinging to for weeks. I wasn't in the boardroom, but I didn't need to be. Sentinel was there, quietly mirroring every login, every shared file, every word spoken. From my apartment, I watched the meeting through logs and metadata, piecing the scene together like a conductor reading notes off a sheet of music. Richard froze. His practiced charm faltered for the first time. He leaned back in his chair, buying time with that rehearsed smile of his. Sentinel, he began carefully, is an internal system, a legacy tool built and maintained by our architecture team for years. Nothing proprietary beyond Carrion walls. But the silence that followed told me no one believed him. Then came the voice that made the air shift, Elliot Crane. Senior partner at Havenbrook Capital. The man whose early investment had saved Carrion from collapse years ago. Calm, deliberate, with the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise itself. That's interesting, Elliot said. Because I distinctly remember meeting with Ethan Cole 3 years ago in Boston. He sketched Sentinel's framework on a napkin for me, called it, and I quote, the nervous system behind the noise. And I still have that napkin. Signed. I leaned back in my chair at home, jaw tight but steady. After months of silence, after being erased and humiliated, my name was finally spoken in the right room, by the right voice. Savannah Miller shifted in her seat. I could almost see her knuckles whitening as she gripped her pen. Trey avoided eye contact, tapping nervously at his smartwatch like it could save him. And Richard's face lost all color. One of the Zurich investors broke the silence. So if Sentinel isn't ours, then what exactly have we been depending on? No one answered. Not right away. Because the truth was sitting in that room like a loaded weapon. Sentinel wasn't theirs. It was mine. Always had been. And here's where the irony hit hardest. Richard had spent weeks erasing me, Savannah had tried to overwrite me, Trey had nearly triggered Sentinel's failsafes by accident. And yet, every dollar of revenue, every client they bragged about, every investor they convinced, it all sat on top of a system they didn't own. A system I designed, I deployed, and I still controlled. If you've ever been underestimated, written off, only to have the truth finally surface in front of the very people who once ignored you, you know how satisfying that moment is. Have you ever had someone try to steal credit for your work, only for the spotlight to swing back your way at the perfect time? If you've lived that, share your story in the comments, because those are the moments that define us. Back in the boardroom, the pressure mounted. Richard stammered something about documentation gaps and pending clarifications. Savannah tried to pivot with polished slides, but the investors weren't listening anymore. They had their question, and now they wanted answers. And in that silence, I felt it, the balance shifting. For the first time since Richard's smug smile across the conference table months ago, Carrion wasn't in control. I didn't smile, not fully. But I breathed easier. Because this wasn't revenge. This was recognition. And it was long overdue. Sitting in my apartment, Sentinel's dashboard glowing, I thought about the box of my belongings sitting in the corner. My mug, my notebooks, the yellow folder with the original Sentinel diagrams signed E. Cole, April 2016. Proof that no amount of corporate spin could erase the truth. And as I watched Richard stumble through excuses, as Savannah avoided the investor's eyes, as Trey tried and failed to interject, I realized something. Carrion wasn't just fighting system glitches anymore. They were fighting their own arrogance. And arrogance always loses. By the time the meeting ended 20 minutes early, no decisions made, no reassurances offered, I knew what came next. More questions. More doubt. More cracks in the empire I once held together with invisible code. And me? I didn't need to say a word. Sentinel had already spoken for me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or replaced, only to rise again when the truth could no longer be ignored, make sure you subscribe. Because the storm isn't over yet. The biggest fall is still to come. The cracks were no longer invisible. By the following week, Carrion's collapse wasn't whispered in hallways or buried in logs, it was happening out in the open. Systems staggered, payroll froze, clients shouted, and the empire Richard Hayes built on arrogance began slipping through his hands. I sat in my apartment, Sentinel's console humming steady, every disruption documented in clean lines of code. But I didn't need the logs to know what was happening. I could see it in headlines creeping across niche tech journals, critical architecture mismanagement at Carrion Technologies. Investor confidence shaken. System ownership in question. Richard tried damage control. He scheduled a company-wide town hall, streaming live to every screen across Carrion's campuses. I watched it, Sentinel tracking the feed in real time. Richard stood under bright lights, suit tailored sharp, his tone dripping with manufactured calm. "We are experiencing temporary issues," he said, "but we remain committed to innovation and transparency." But transparency doesn't come with locked doors and missing answers. And the employees knew it. The chat window beneath the stream filled with questions he refused to acknowledge. Why can't we process payroll? Why are clients calling us directly? Who really owns Sentinel? Savannah Miller stood beside him, smile practiced, her words crisp but hollow. She spoke of transition roadmaps and restructuring phases, while Trey Dawson clicked nervously through slides that glitched mid-transition. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very system powering their presentation was suffocating beneath their feet. And then it happened. Midway through the broadcast, Sentinel nudged. A subtle disruption, timed perfectly. Slides froze. Richard's mic cut in and out, his polished pitch fractured by static. Savannah leaned forward, panic flickering across her face, while Trey tapped furiously at his tablet, clueless. Thousands of employees watched live as their leadership faltered in real time. I leaned back in my chair, silent. I didn't need to crash their empire. They were doing it themselves. All I had to do was let Sentinel show them the truth, that they were never in control. Have you ever watched someone who wronged you unravel under the weight of their own lies? It's not about revenge. It's about patience. About knowing the truth doesn't need a megaphone, it just needs time. And here's a question for you. If you were in my shoes, would you step in and expose the truth yourself, or would you let them destroy themselves piece by piece? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see how many of you would choose silence over fire. By the end of the town hall, confidence was gone. The investors weren't just doubtful anymore, they were furious. Board calls leaked, whispers of emergency leadership transition echoed across networks. And for the first time, Richard Hayes's name appeared in headlines next to the word failure. Savannah tried to salvage her role, pushing hard in internal memos, claiming she had a plan. But Sentinel caught her attempts, failed credential escalations, repeated tries to access directories she never built, requests flagged red in the logs. To me, it was almost poetic, the protégé who had once depended on me for everything, now clawing desperately at doors she could never open. Trey? He all but vanished. His brash confidence reduced to silence, his tasks reassigned after too many blunders. Even Felix, the one who first stumbled across Sentinel's shadow, kept his head down. I didn't blame him. He was curious, not malicious. And curiosity can survive. Arrogance cannot. By the close of that week, Carrion's empire was no longer polished glass and chrome. It was cracks, visible to everyone. Investors demanded answers. Employees questioned leadership. Clients pulled contracts. And every time Richard tried to assure them, Sentinel was there, slowing, freezing, whispering the truth he couldn't admit. And me? I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply sat in the quiet of my apartment, the weight of 18 years no longer heavy but balanced. Because power doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes, power comes from letting others feel what you've always known, that without you, there is no foundation. If this story resonates, if you've ever watched arrogance collapse under its own weight, make sure you subscribe. The fall of Carrion isn't over yet. The final move is still waiting. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. The empire wasn't just cracking anymore, it was crumbling. By the second week, Carrion Technologies had become a case study in how arrogance and silence can topple a giant. Investors were pulling funding, employees were updating resumes, and clients were searching for safer ground. And me? I was sitting in my apartment, staring at Sentinel's console, knowing the next move belonged to me. Richard Hayes still clung to his throne. He issued hollow memos about stability and resilience, but the truth was written in every log I monitored. Failed logins. Repeated diagnostic pings. Desperate attempts to reset systems that no longer obeyed them. Richard had lost the boardroom. He just hadn't realized it yet. Savannah Miller was worse. My former protégé, now fully exposed, had been caught red-handed trying to rewrite Sentinel's architecture under her own name. The logs didn't lie. Every unauthorized attempt was time-stamped, her credentials printed in cold text. I knew sooner or later, those records would end up in the hands of people far above her pay grade. And when they did, Savannah wouldn't just lose her title, she'd lose her reputation. Trey Dawson had already disappeared into irrelevance. Once full of swagger, now reduced to silence. I didn't even need Sentinel to tell me that. The absence of noise was proof enough. And Felix Tran? He kept his head down, still curious but careful. I respected that. Curiosity wasn't the enemy. Pride was. So here I was 18 years in, the architect of everything Carrion depended on, staring at the blinking cursor of Sentinel's terminal. One command was all it would take to wipe everything. To pull the spine out of the company and let it collapse completely. No more delays, no more whispers, no more illusions. Just silence. My fingers hovered above the keys. I could almost hear my father's voice again. If they don't see you, make sure they feel you in the results. But then I thought about the people behind the glass. Not Richard. Not Savannah. Not the ones who had turned their backs when I needed them most. I thought about the engineers who worked late nights on projects they believed in. The analysts juggling endless dashboards. The interns like Felix who still believed they were building something that mattered. If I destroyed Sentinel, I wouldn't just be punishing arrogance, I'd be punishing them too. And that wasn't me. So I made a different choice. I didn't type the kill command. Instead, I opened Sentinel's override menu, the one hidden so deep it had never been touched by anyone but me. And I began drafting a migration protocol. Not for Carrion. For me. Sentinel would be reborn, stripped of Carrion's chains, rebuilt for a company that actually deserved it. A company where integrity outweighed image. A company like the one Ava Lynn had quietly offered me a seat in. CTO. Clean slate. No politics, no games. Just building again. And in that moment, I realized the final move wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. Have you ever faced a choice like that? The chance to destroy someone who hurt you, or to walk away and build something better? Which would you choose? Comment below. Because trust me, that decision says more about who you are than anything else. By the end of that month, Carrion's stock had cratered. Richard Hayes resigned under personal reasons. Savannah Miller vanished from press releases, her name scrubbed from leadership pages. And the company I had once carried on my shoulders became just another cautionary tale in the tech world. But me? I wasn't erased anymore. I was starting over. Sentinel wasn't a ghost in their wires, it was the brain of a new system, one I renamed Sentinel-1. Built not out of spite, but out of trust. Out of silence, reborn into clarity. Standing on the rooftop of my new office, looking out over Boston's skyline, I could see Carrion's tower glinting in the distance. Once, it had been everything to me. Now, it was just a reflection of what happens when arrogance blinds leadership. And I smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough. Because I knew something Richard and Savannah never did. You can fire a title, but you can't erase the architect who laid the foundation. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever been overlooked, betrayed, or underestimated, only to rise again stronger, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes the quietest moves are the ones that change everything. Some stories end with fire. Others end with silence. Mine ended with both, and somewhere in that balance, I found my freedom. By the time Carrion's tower finally dimmed, when its glass floors looked half empty and its name slipped from headlines like a fading echo, I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was free. 18 years of loyalty had been buried under arrogance, but from that same soil, I built something stronger. Sentinel-1 wasn't just code. It was proof that integrity outlasts noise. I think back often to that Monday morning, the boardroom full of faces that refused to meet my eyes, Richard Hayes sliding an envelope across polished glass, Savannah Miller turning her head away like I'd never existed. That silence hurt. But in the end, silence became my weapon. Because while they were busy pretending I didn't matter, I was already building the reminder that I did. And that's the lesson I want you to take from this story. Power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it waits. It outlasts. It shows itself when the lies have burned away and only truth remains. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or replaced, I know how heavy that silence feels. I know what it's like to pour yourself into something, only for others to dismiss it like it never existed. But here's the truth. They can take the title off your badge, they can erase your name from the org chart, but they can't erase the foundation you laid. That foundation lives in every line of code, every decision, every late night you spent building. And one day, it speaks for you louder than any boardroom ever could. So I'll ask you this, what's your sentinel? What's the thing you've built, quietly, consistently, without applause, that nobody can take away from you? Think about it. And if you're willing, share it in the comments. Because your foundation might be the reminder someone else needs right now, that their silence isn't the end, it's just the pause before recognition. When I look back now, I don't remember carrying as my failure. I remember it as my proof. Proof that survival isn't about fighting louder. It's about knowing when to let arrogance destroy itself, and when to walk away with your legacy intact. And here's the second lesson, betrayal isn't the end. Savannah tried to overwrite me, Richard tried to erase me, Trey tried to play expert while breaking what he didn't understand. But none of them succeeded. Why? Because they mistook noise for power. True power is quiet, precise, patient. So if you're sitting there, listening to this, maybe carrying your own weight of being overlooked, don't let that silence break you. Let it sharpen you. Because one day, that silence will shift, and the spotlight will swing your way. And when it does, the foundation you've built will stand taller than every voice that tried to bury it. Now, carrion is a cautionary tale. Richard Hayes is a footnote. Savannah Miller is a name erased from leadership boards. But me? I'm not a ghost in someone else's system anymore. I'm the architect of my own. And the future of Sentinel-1 isn't built on arrogance, it's built on trust. If this story has stayed with you, if it made you reflect on your own battles, your own silences, your own quiet victories, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and join me for more stories of resilience, revenge, and redemption. Because sometimes the systems we build go down. But the right ones? The right ones always restart.